Well, Andrew, it's a pleasure to speak to you. You've been on my feed for a long time, and I think we organized this interview before the war. So I think the timing of it now and the delays we've had, I think it was on my end, so I apologize, worked to our advantage because the circumstances now are pretty extraordinary. So I'm going to jump right into it. What was your first reaction when Israel attacked Iran? Especially considering you weren't surprised. Okay, go ahead.
I wasn't surprised. Yeah, I've actually been calling this an Israel-Iran war for over a year. The fact that Israel's been fighting proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas, and even taking inbound rockets directly from Iran, shows who is the true aggressor in Israel's eyes. So the fact that they decided to bomb them again in June, actually break sovereign borders and yet again incur into Iran, was not a surprise to me. In fact, about 4 months ago, intelligence analysts worldwide were kind of estimating it was going to be late June, early July, when Israel launched an attack specifically against the nuclear infrastructure in Iran.
So then why was Iran caught by surprise? Because there's no way they weren't. All their commanders, their military commanders were hit, all their nuclear facilities were hit, and it took them a long time to respond.
I would say it didn't take them that long to respond. If you recall, there were rockets that were being launched back into Israel by the hundreds within just a few hours of the strike. There was a surprise element because nobody knows what day, what time, and what locations will be hit. That's part of what intelligence is supposed to cover. And Iran's intelligence is strong, but it's obviously not as strong as Israel, especially considering the fact that Israel's partners in this are the United States and some of the other Western allies. So they didn't know which facilities, they didn't know what day, they didn't know what time, they didn't know which officers might be targeted. So that was Israel's advantage. And Israel understood that the longer they waited, the more they risked losing that advantage of surprise.
Yeah, and I think Netanyahu was, there were reports that his son was about to have a wedding. So I think Iran would have assumed Netanyahu was going to his son's wedding. Also, Trump was hinting at negotiations for Sunday, and there were reports, apparently leaks, that Trump told Israel not to respond militarily. I think also there were reports that Netanyahu was meant to go on a holiday, or meant to go on a trip to the US for negotiations. So you think all those were intentional to mislead Iran?
I don't think all of them were intentional. I think that there was a bit of geopolitical positioning that we saw play out here, Mario. The United States was about to have their 250th anniversary parade, a parade down Washington, D.C., something that was very high profile. Trump was very focused on it. It was supposed to be like this, rah, 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 America anniversary of 250 years of the existence of the Army. And that was scheduled for Saturday. So Trump was very focused in one area, plus he was planning on having negotiations start again on Sunday. So you could see that Netanyahu's timing showed that he was not necessarily going to kowtow to the West. He was not going to obey Donald Trump's direction. He was going to demonstrate his own unilateral power and decision-making power. So I think that played into part of it, as well as Netanyahu's own personal schedule, where he wanted to make sure that a message was sent in a time that was convenient for his leadership, not a time that was convenient for the West.
Oh, wow. So you think Israel acted without America's permission?
I don't know that they acted without America's permission, but I would say that they didn't have America's full support. I think Israel's playing a very interesting game here that on one hand is very strategic, but on the other hand is also very risky. Netanyahu is consistently expanding his conflict area. What used to be a conflict with just Hamas in just Gaza has now turned into a conflict with Hezbollah. He's taken ground in Syria. He's launched multiple airstrikes now into Iran. He has pushed land troops into Iran. And Israel and Iran are not geographic neighbors. They have to go through other territory to get to each other. So you've got this situation where Netanyahu understands he's unpopular at home and he's unpopular abroad. But by taking the fight to Iran, he gets to win back some favor from the West, because the United States likes the idea of a weak Iran. Saudi Arabia and UAE like the idea of a weak Iran. So you've got this situation where Israel can kind of win back favor by doing what it already wants to do.
Did you misspeak when you said Israel sent personnel into Iran? Do you mean the Mossad commanders, that the rumors that were within Iran? So you think Israel has? I'd love to. That's my next question. Is like, how did Israel do this? How did Israel get? Well, there's reports of a drone factory, not only drone trucks, but a drone factory within Iran. I'm not sure if that's accurate or that's way too far-fetched. But of course, the trucks. Just a couple of hours ago, Iran says they intercepted another drone truck, Israeli drone truck. Just take us down that rabbit hole of how these things work, how long it takes to plan them, and how realistic are they? It seems like a Bond movie right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the things that makes Mossad so unique among intelligence services worldwide is they really are like a Bond movie. The reason Mossad is so dangerous is because they plan operations many, many years in advance, and they put them on a shelf just in case they ever need to execute them. And Mossad has what's known in the intelligence world as a high risk tolerance. A high risk tolerance means it will take operations, it will take actions that other countries would never dream to take because the risk is too high. The risk of blowback, the risk of discovery, the risk of death, the risk of capture. Mossad takes risks that nobody else takes, and as a result of that, they get this reputation of being like spies in the movies. So to answer your question, Mario, about how this takes place, I mean, the short answer is Mossad has been targeting Iran for decades. Ever since Israel said, or I'm sorry, ever since Iran made it common knowledge that its goal was to eradicate Israel, Israel started making plans to eradicate Iran. So they have all these plans on a shelf. They just have to choose which plan they're going to pull off the shelf, and it's like a recipe, which plan they're going to take, and then which plan they're going to develop and actually start to create. Do I believe they made a drone factory? No. Do I believe that they had the ability to launch drones from within Iran's borders? Absolutely.
How does that compare to what happened in Russia, the Ukrainian operation?
So that's a great point. Are you talking about the Russia invasion of Ukraine, or are you talking about Ukraine's?
No, the Ukraine drone operation a couple of weeks ago, having trucks of drones within Russia, and that was a very successful operation. Do you think Mossad copied that operation? Do you think there was intelligence sharing? Obviously, a weaker Iran means a weaker Russia. And how similar are these two operations?
So I would say that there are many similarities that are superficial. They're both drone operations. They're both drone operations launched from within a sovereign border. They're both modern day warfare that we've never seen before. So you've got a number of similarities there. In one case, I would say Mossad was carrying out a series of operations that were against high value targets that were high profile intentionally. Where what you have with Ukraine, and what you continue to see with Ukraine, is that Ukraine will launch drones. They will try to take out assets that are strategically relevant, but they don't necessarily try to go for headline damage like you see with Israel.
Yeah, that was crazy. You got the IRGC commander, the chief of staff of the Iranian armed forces, the senior IRGC commander and commander of the Qatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters. You got the commander of the IRGC Airspace Force. And the list goes on. Senior advisor, that's a big one. Senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader and the chief nuclear negotiator, which is a weird one to target if they're looking for some sort of deal with the US, because Trump is saying he would like a deal with Iran, but then the chief negotiator has just been assassinated. You've got the deputy chief of staff of intelligence for intelligence affairs of the armed forces general staff. So essentially, when I spoke to the IDF spokesperson, he said they assassinated 15 out of 20, and that was yesterday. I think another 2 got assassinated after my interview with him. So I'd say 17 out of 20 senior commanders, and 9 out of 11 nuclear scientists. The level of success is unheard of. I haven't seen it in any other. Is there anything you can compare it to? And what does that say about Israel's capabilities?
So the only thing you can compare this to is other Israeli strikes. And Israel has demonstrated this kind of success all through the 2000s and the 90s, where it goes in and it targets individuals of high position or unique position very specifically with very little collateral damage. It's quite shocking how well they execute their series of attacks. I also want to highlight, though, Mario, your verbiage is exactly correct. What Israel is doing is a series of assassinations. In order for something to be an assassination, it has to be politically motivated. Israel was never under attack from Iran. Iran was not aggressing Israel directly. right? There's a conflict, there's a larger conflict going on through proxy players, without a doubt. However, what's known as interstate war, or between two different countries, this idea of interstate war was not occurring. There was no invasion of Israel by Iran. There was no invasion of Iran by Israel until this attack, right? This attack showed both ground forces and air forces and other forces as well that were all being used to threaten Iran's sovereignty. So that act of war is now something the whole world has to kind of chew on and deal with because it was instigated by Israel.
So I wanted to ask you more questions on how you think Mossad were able to achieve these attacks. A bit more speculation there, but a piece of news just came in the wire just now, about 1 minute ago. Iran ready to abandon enrichment if it can save face. That's according to the Iran Wire. Not sure how legitimate that is, but the team posted on my account saying a senior Iranian diplomat has told Iran Wire what many suspect but no one had confirmed. Tehran is prepared to halt uranium enrichment, not out of goodwill, but to avoid collapse. Iranian diplomat said the following: the real priority of the supreme leader is survival. We don't want to repeat Saddam Hussein's mistake. Israel's strikes have shattered Iran's military command, scorched neighborhoods across Tehran, and pushed the regime to the brink. The diplomat warned the IRGC is losing control and morale is cracking. But Tehran isn't begging, it wants a deal, not a surrender photo op. Mr. Trump may be the only person who can end this quickly and peacefully, according to the diplomat speaking to Iran Wire. That's a pretty shocking revelation, if true. Shocking to an extent. I think we've seen the devastation that Israel's caused Iran. I did have analysts yesterday and the day before. I've had Scott Ritter and Colonel McGregor, who kind of disagreed with many, thinking Iran still has a lot of capabilities and does not need to kowtow to Israel. But if this report is true, and I want to get your thoughts on it, that could change things. So first, do you think this report is true? Iran is in such a position where it's looking at survival rather than continuing the war and trying to keep its uranium enrichment? And number two, if this is true, do you think Israel would be open to a deal?
The question of whether or not Israel's open to a deal, I think, is the truly operative question here, because I think the whole world is wondering what Israel is after. Are they trying to destroy Iran? Are they trying to destroy Iran's nuclear capability? Is Netanyahu just trying to continue to create conflict so that he doesn't have to deal with his own criminal trial in Israel? We're not exactly sure what Israel's goal is. But I will say this, that the sentiment that was shared in that clip, that review that you just gave, that sentiment is most likely true. That the theocracy understands that they are in danger of a potential of losing too much face, even possible internal uprising or internal conflict. So they want to try to find a way to survive. That I'm surprised that they would make that a public statement, because that makes Iran look weak. That makes the theocracy look weak. I can't imagine that's what they want internal Iranians to think. I'm also wondering if that isn't a piece of disinformation, where Iran wants a break. They want to regroup so that they can direct their capability more effectively, because they were caught by surprise in terms of timing and attack vector. So Iran understands that if they had a few weeks, a few days, a few months, they might be able to set a counterbalance, a counterattack back against Israel, but they can't seem to get that right now. And they don't know when this is going to end. They don't know when Israel will stop increasing their strategic airstrikes. They don't know when the press of Israeli attack is going to actually slow down.
By the way, if you see me looking down, I was just looking at the news coming in. There's a lot of reports now of strikes happening in Tehran. Also, that's another interesting point. I'd love to get your thoughts on it. That's according to Israel Today, that Israel could be looking at targeting Iran's state TV headquarters. So that's something you talk a lot about, the information warfare that's happening. So Iranians still trust their national TV a lot more than other countries. How effective will such an attack be if they do strike Iran's state TV headquarters?
First of all, if they attack the state TV headquarters, they're attacking a civilian target. And I'm not convinced that the story here is Iran at all, because what's really interesting is how the world's going to respond to Israel. Israel attacking nuclear warheads, everybody can support that. And Israel attacking military targets, everybody can support that. To a certain extent, I think people are looking past the fact that Israel's also attacking and killing civilians through political assassination, like the engineers and the scientists that we've talked about. But if Israel starts to just launch and blow up infrastructure that has to do with media, that's not a military target. Remember how the world responded when Russia started targeting energy facilities in Ukraine, and they started calling that a war crime, and they started calling that a step too far or some sort of non-military target. Russia at least could stand on the fact that Ukraine was using the energy infrastructure to launch counterattacks against Russia. There's no way that you can say that a TV channel is being used to militarily launch counterattacks against a military target. Yeah. So the question becomes, how will the world react to Israel's choices in this conflict against Iran?
What was funny was doing the interview with Scott Ritter. We could start seeing, we were looking together at the missiles landing in Israel as we were speaking. It's just a surreal moment. I want to go back to the discussion we had earlier about how Israel was able to conduct those operations. We know and this might include some speculation, but I'm just really fascinated by it. When it comes to the Hezbollah pagers, what we know, and I'm not sure if any information came out afterwards, is that they went all the way back to the manufacturer. Don't know how they got those information, but hey, it is Mossad. And then they planted a device within the pagers at the manufacturing level, and then they let it continue flowing through to Hezbollah. Instead of sabotaging the manufacturer, let it flow through with these devices, those detonatable devices to make them all detonate. And then that's how they were able to detonate all the pagers for Hezbollah. Now, for Iran, what I'm really fascinated by is two things. The first one is how they were able to target all those military commanders. How difficult is it for an intelligence like the CIA, where you've worked, or like Mossad, to be able to geolocate so many commanders at the same time, with Hezbollah and with Iran? Does that mean they've got spies within the Iranian military leadership? Does that mean, is there a way to kind of track them through digital means? And the second one is, how are they able to have those trucks drive into Iran? I know Iran's got a pretty massive border, but is that a difficult operation as well?
So, two great questions. The answer to your first question about the fidelity of targeting down to an individual level and whether or not that's how difficult that is. In the digital era, it's surprisingly not hard to identify a target down to within approximately 1/2 of 1 meter of where they are at any given time. It depends on whether or not you have what's known as a unique selector. A selector is essentially like your cell phone. Your cell phone number is a selector. Your email address is a selector. There are certain metadata that's carried on your laptop, on your internet, on cellular devices, on your tablet, that identify you as a unique user. So then what is actually happening is they're not targeting the individual, they're targeting the hardware. So they're targeting the actual device that's transmitting the signal that they're able to geolocate. So much of intelligence is spent identifying and collecting selectors so that when you need to target that individual with high fidelity, you'll know where they are. Whether you need to target them for a kinetic strike, like we're talking about with Israel, or whether you need to target them for a human operation because you need someone to bump them, or someone to seduce them, or someone to extract information, you always want to know where that person is. And we live in an era where you can do that. You can do that with just commercial technology. That's how advertisers get onto your phone as well. They geo-target you as a specific user based on your selectors. So is it difficult to collect that information? No, but it is difficult to carry out kinetic strikes when you have that information, because now you have to send high fidelity armaments in to actually strike the target, and strike the target where they are. There's always a risk for collateral damage. Maybe the cell phone is in the house, but the owner is in the backyard. So if you strike the house, you may not actually hit the backyard if you're using a highly targetable device. So there's always risk associated with it. The second question that you had about driving trucks across the Iranian border, this is a two-part challenge, right? First, borders are very difficult to police. That's why you see debates all around the world about how much people can and can't control immigration. The United States is trying to build walls because it understands that the border is very porous. The same thing is true, especially along coastline. You live in Dubai. Think about how much coastline in Dubai is not actively policed, right? How much coastline could anybody just sail a small sailboat up to and dock the sailboat somewhere, park the sailboat at anchor, and take a little dinghy, and they can walk right into the downtown Dubai without going through immigration, without anybody even knowing that they're there. The same thing is true for desert border, and a desert border is a lot of what Iran has to deal with. So could somebody get through a porous border? Absolutely. And Iran isn't a very wealthy country. It's not like it has a large border patrol, border protective service. So getting across the border may not be as difficult as people think. Being able to even get across the border and stay there for an extended period of time to build a drone launch facility is not beyond the realm of realistic.
That makes me question something else. I used to have debates with my team on whether things like Pegasus are real and what are their actual capabilities. So if I have my phone right now, and Tucker used to talk about how he lives with the fact that the intelligence have access to all his calls and his phone and everything. I'm in the middle. I know that WhatsApp is encrypted, but I know whenever I have high-level meetings with people, I have to put it in those, the box that blocks all the transmissions. You put it before meetings. So that's making, kind of bringing up those questions again. Can an intelligence service, one as sophisticated as Mossad or the US or some European countries or even China, for my phone or your phone, let's just go my phone, it's more basic. For my phone, would they be able to, you think, in your opinion, be able to access all my calls, landline calls, WhatsApp calls, Signal calls, Telegram, my chats? Could they listen to me at any time? Or, people are just getting a bit too excited there?
No, if anybody believes they have privacy, then they are misled. If we have a saying in the intelligence world that you're only as safe as your level of interest. If you're not interesting to people, if you're just a normal person going about a normal life, doing a normal thing, nobody's watching you. So you blend into the crowd, you blend into the noise. If they wanted to collect against you, then you would be interesting. The people who are supremely interesting, those are the people who every capability that an intelligence service has is trying to get onto your phone, trying to get into your computer, trying to get into your smart watch, your smart refrigerator, your smart TV. They're trying to get into the smart watches and the smart devices of your children and your wife and your mother-in-law and your father-in-law. If you're a target, there's no technical place to hide. You will be penetrated. So I say that because WhatsApp is a fantastic example. WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted. So what that means is if anybody cracks the encryption on one end or the other, then they have all of your messages. They have all of your phone calls. They can basically simulate your phone. So if someone were to clone your phone, they would clone your WhatsApp security key, and now anybody who calls that cloned phone is going to feel like they're calling your phone. So It's not actually safe. The same thing is true with Signal. There's a way to get around all of these tools because as fast as the technology can be created, there are intelligence organizations and criminal organizations who are trying to reverse engineer it.
Do you think a company like Meta would give a backdoor access to the intelligence services?
Absolutely. I think any company that wants to survive in its own legislative environment is going to cooperate with the intelligence services, because the last thing, anybody like Apple or Huawei or Meta, the last thing they want to do is have government policy turn against them and kill their company. So they will cooperate.
Holy shit.
Yeah, if you feel like you're safe, you're not safe. I don't know why anybody thinks that there's a capability that just doesn't exist to find who you are, what you're saying, or who you're talking to. In a world where we have terrorists and human smugglers and drug traffickers, in a world where there are bombs that are literally hitting individual targets in Iran and Israel and Ukraine, how in the world do people feel like we're safe anywhere? The only place that you're safe is if you aren't a threat. If you actually don't try to, stir up the hornet's nest, then people just ignore you. But if you present yourself as a threat, then capabilities will be poured into you.
Now, I've lived with the fact that, similar to Tucker Carlson, I'm like, look, I don't think they listen to all my communication, and I've taken measures, but I know there's like an 80-90% chance those measures are going to be enough. Little me, I'm not going to be able to compete against the CIA or Chinese intelligence or Mossad or any Arab intelligence. So I've just, and especially with AI coming in as well, like, people talk to ChatGPT like it's their best friend. I speak to a lot of these leaders in the AI world, and they all speak, they all have an understanding that privacy is dead. And some of them are even like, Mario, we're actually considering open sourcing everything about us. People will have access to our chats, to our emails, everything. People are actually considering that because they know the world that we live in is just no longer a private world. And as AI gets integrated into everything we do, anyone that has access to your agents will have access to literally everything about you. Which is a pretty crazy world that leads to a potential dystopian world with centralization of power. But kind of bringing it back to this, because I would have had a 2-hour conversation with you just about that if it wasn't for a war going on as we speak. Now, we've talked about what Israel has done. I want to go to Iran and what Iran's achieved. What was your reaction when you saw their response? We saw 250 missiles on the first day, another, I think, about 100 on the second day. Today's the third day. We've had about the same. I think a few of them hit southern Israel from memory and caused significant damage. But at the same time, we haven't seen Hezbollah respond. Houthis responded with barely anything. What's your general take on the response so far?
I think that what we're seeing is Israel's military strategy really working right now. Israel, when they launched against Hamas, Hamas was just a kind of a match in a matchbox that was a very convenient time to get aggressive against multiple different proxies for Iran. So with the movement after the October 6th attacks, after the October 7th attacks. With that movement into Gaza, that kind of started Israel on this larger strategy of let's neutralize Hamas, and then let's neutralize Hezbollah. And by neutralizing those two targets, or by eviscerating
and the Houthis as well, which didn't take a lot, but the Houthis.
Correct.
It's pretty quick.
Essentially, what they did is they secured their western border, and then they secured their northern border, and then they secured their southern border. And all that was left as an attack vector was to the east, coming from Iran directly. So Israel has done a good job of systematically reducing Iran's capabilities around the actual nation state of Israel. So what we're seeing from Iran is that it's launching only the only capability it really has left, which is rockets and missiles from sites in Iran. Now, my concern is that if there is a more desperate capability, if Iran has a nuclear weapon, if they have a briefcase nuke, if they've been given a nuclear capability by China or Russia, they may be considering whether or not they want to use that capability, because they are like a dog in a corner right now, and they are desperate. So that's my bigger concern here. I don't necessarily think that we're going to see Iran launch a military strike against Israel that's joint in nature, that involves a navy and an army and an air force. But I am curious what desperate measure Iran will take.
Do you think Iran will try to target high-level officials, Israeli officials as well?
I don't think it can do that right now. I don't know that Iran has the capability or sophistication to be able to do that. I also don't know that they have the intelligence required and the fidelity required to be able to do a similar strike as what Israel has done to them.
How effective is Iranian intelligence? I think it's the IRGC and the MOIS, I think it's called. Do you know how effective those are? What would you expect them to be?
MOIS is a relatively effective tool. IRGC is a highly effective tool. But the problem is that they're both very small, and they're both very limited in terms of their scope of operations. So even if you were to call on the full strength of MOIS and the full strength of IRGC, they'd be able to do something damaging, but they wouldn't be able to do something critically or strategically imperative, kind of like what we've seen with Israel. Israel's able to take Mossad and use Mossad in a broad aperture that is also complemented by Air Force and complemented by military and ground forces. Iran is unlikely to be able to do the same kind of thing.
That puts them in a pretty bad position. What's left for them? They're shooting those missiles at Israel. Their intelligence is limited. They're not striking U.S. bases. I don't know if you think they will, but I wouldn't think they want the U.S. to get involved. They can't even handle Israel, and we saw the reports earlier potentially of them looking for some sort of deal, some sort of out, and seeking their survival. So what could Iran do, if anything? What could we see in Israel? Could we see some sort of, could they resort to terrorist attacks? Because all other means, they've exhausted all other means?
I think the most interesting calls that I want to be listening to right now are the calls between Iranian leadership and Chinese leadership and Russian leadership and North Korean leadership, because you know those calls are happening, right? We're in a world, a geopolitical landscape where it's very much East versus West. It's the United States and allies of the United States against a growing conglomerate of Eastern powers that include China and Russia and North Korea and Iran. We've seen it in Ukraine. We've seen it, across Syria. We've seen it in multiple conflict zones. So I'm very curious, what is Iran asking for from those other nefarious partners that it has? I'm also curious, what is Iran going to do against Western partners? Because Iran has very close economic ties with UAE. And Iran is the breadbasket of the Middle East in a lot of ways. So is Iran going to somehow use its leverage with the Middle Eastern powers that are allies with the United States to gain some sort of leverage? There's not a lot that I think Iran is going to be able to do militarily. There's not a lot that it can do through its intelligence services. It can't punch back the same way it's being punched. But that doesn't mean it can't cause disruption and damage in some other way. My biggest concern here, Mario, to be very frank, is that if Iran just quietly takes the hit, then the larger opinion of Israel just continues to go down, because the world will start to see Israel as a bully, and they will start to see Israel as an authoritarian state, and they will start to see Israel as an untrustworthy ally. And we've been seeing that all through Israeli conflict, for the last year and a half. So I think Iran understands that the information warfare landscape might be better to its advantage than the actual military landscape.
Going to China and Russia, how could they get involved, if at all? What type of support could they offer Iran, and could we go to as far as potential military involvement, supplying some sort of weapons to Iran as well?
So that's the big question. I could absolutely see Russia and China and North Korea executing weapons sales, executing trade where they send weapons in exchange for oil or in exchange for other natural resources. I could see them arming and equipping and sharing intelligence, of course, also with Iran. I could see them facilitating Iranian movements that are illegal, right? Facilitating an IRGC movement from Iran into Israel or from Iran into Lebanon by way of some sort of Chinese transport or Russian transport, obfuscating the movement altogether. These are all realistic possibilities and ways that those countries would gain favor and continue to show support for Iran. The I think strategic benefit of Russia and China and North Korea showing support to Iran is that Iran is well positioned in the Middle East. Iran is already a rogue nation in the eyes of the world. It's already a world that doesn't want to be part of a larger world order. So they have access to oil, they have access to natural resources, they have access to personnel and people and a theocracy that's been largely shaped by an ideology that isn't accurate, which is exactly the kind of ideology that thrives in those Eastern countries, right? Russia shapes its ideology, China shapes its ideology, North Korea shapes its ideology. So they don't want to just cut Iran off, but they also don't necessarily want to get pulled into a larger conflict that drains their resources because of Iran's choices. So it's going to be an interesting few months to see how it all plays out.
I asked a question to the Israeli ambassador to the US yesterday about the risk of Russia using the peace negotiations as a way to pressure the US to end the war against Iran, and China leveraging the tariff negotiations with Trump to try to end the war in Iran. Do you think that's a possibility as well?
That's the most realistic possibility, to be honest. I think that what we're seeing here is that Israel gets to attack Iran, which is something it wants to do, and that's also something that the West wants somebody to do, so they might as well support Israel in doing that. And of course, the weapons that Israel's using to launch that attack are Western-made weapons. So the U.S. economy is benefiting from the conflict that Israel launches not only against Hezbollah and Hamas, but also against Israel. So there's lots of secondary benefits that are happening to the United States. The idea is, how do you make those benefits less beneficial? And that's going to be what you see with Russia and China. Are they going to use those negotiations for Ukraine and those negotiations for tariffs as a counterpoint to protect Iran? like I was saying, the conversation here, to me, the relevant conversation is less about Iran and more about Israel, because there's an important thing that's also happening here, Mario. Every time Israel launches a new attack, every time they expand their territory, every time they initiate a new conflict, like they initiated the conflict in Gaza, and they initiated the conflict in Syria, and they initiated the conflict in Iran. Every time Israel initiates a new conflict, they're creating a new foundation of future radicals that will hate Israel. So the Iranian theocracy is not going to look weak coming out of this. If anything, there's going to be a whole fresh foundation of people who now believe what the theocracy has to say and all agree that Israel needs to be destroyed. And the same thing is happening in Gaza, and the same thing's happening in Lebanon, and the same thing's happening in Yemen. There's radicals are always being born because they're feeling the devastation of a superior military force from Israel. The United States learned this the hard way on 9/11, and it took us 20 years to figure this out before we decided that fighting against ideological radicals is a very difficult game, because the harder you fight, the more radicals you create.
Yeah, and there's 90 million people in Iran. That goes to the next point, though, is there's reports that Israel is potentially looking at a regime change in Iran. That's an objective of theirs. We heard Netanyahu's speech a couple of days ago. How unlikely is it that this is not, just a potential bonus from the war, but that's not an objective or an actual objective that they're trying to reach? And number two, so first, is it an objective? And number two, if they do achieve that objective, what does that mean for Israel, Iran, and the rest of the Middle East?
So I would say that it's a very likely objective for Israel to pursue regime change, because it understands that unless they want to kill every Iranian citizen, what they need to do is change the government. And if they can change the government, then they would change the regime. The challenge, though, is that the current Iranian government is a mixed bag. Iran was already modernizing on its own. Its most recent is less extremist, less radical, less theocratic than its previous president. So in many ways, Israel's upsetting a society that was already transitioning in the right direction. And now they've assaulted and they're threatening the livelihood of an entire country because they disagreed with a handful of senior politicians that we now know they could have killed those politicians at any time, right? So if they are pursuing a regime change, it is not only likely, but when they pursue a regime change, the question becomes who will replace the current regime? Will they allow the Iranians to elect their own person? Will they try to appoint somebody themselves? Will they make Iran a shadow state, a puppet state of Israel? Will they try? And if they do, what comes next? Unfortunately, I think, Israel's actions are, tactically sound, but strategically flawed. They're doing an excellent job in choosing what tactics they use in order to execute operations that disrupt Iranian nuclear ambitions. But strategically, what are they trying to achieve? Are they trying to end Iran? Are they trying to end the theocracy? Are they trying to destroy radical anti-Israel sentiment? What are they trying to do? And how far are they willing to go? Because I don't think that they've thought it through. Netanyahu has a reputation now for starting conflict with no strategic end in sight, which is why he lost his war cabinet and why you see the conflict, even within Israel, opposing Netanyahu.
Yeah, and there's a discussion that Israel's goal of reaching a regime change in Iran could end up leading to a government change within Israel as people just get exhausted with all the wars. And I'm guessing you see that as would you say a high probability or just a possibility?
I think Netanyahu understands it as well. Like as soon as the Israeli people aren't thrown into a war, they're going to work on throwing out the people in their own political chain of command who have caused all this conflict. Israel is not, like the majority of Israelis aren't a huge fan of Netanyahu. They don't like his decisions, they don't like his policies, they don't like his authoritarian approach, they don't like his hawkish far-right government. So the only tool he has to prevent against an internal kind of overthrow is by keeping everybody's eyes focused external to Israel.
What worries me about a regime change, even if a regime is, if you compare the current regime to the pre-revolution Shah, Iran was, many people don't know, Iran was a very close ally. The closest ally within the Middle East to Israel. It was, I think, the first country or the second country to to recognize the existence of Israel. And a very liberal country. You'd see women walking around with bikinis to the Iran we see today. So I wouldn't be surprised if many people from the West, like me, like yourself, that would prefer a different government in Iran. But the risks of that, as we've seen in Syria, as we've seen in Libya, and the list goes on, is that could lead to just a complete destruction of a country. Like a country that is, has 80, 90% of the population in poverty, like we see in Yemen, that has no rule of law, like we see in Iraq, that is liberal, is not really better than a country. It's not too liberal, but at least it functions like some really wealthy countries that many of us visit. So do you worry that could be a case, that Israel's attempt for a regime change could be successful, but that could lead to more disastrous consequences for Iran and neighboring countries? And what would that mean for the region? We've got 90 people living in poverty, similar to what we have in Yemen, or a country is completely that has no rule of law and that has nuclear facilities as well.
So you're nailing all the right points there, Mario. I'm not sure that Israel or the United States cares whether or not Iran falls into political disarray, falls into some sort of internal civil war, similar to Libya and Syria and Yemen. I'm not sure that they're thinking about that in terms of an economic impact or a long-term military impact. I think their short-term idea is if it implodes and it falls apart, then we're all better for it. We're all a little bit safer. But the truth is that just because Iran isn't really inside Israel's sphere of influence and Iran isn't inside the United States' sphere of influence doesn't mean that Iran isn't inside the sphere of influence of close allies, right? We've got all of your Khaliji Arab states that have some sort of trade relationship with Iran, and then you have Iran's relationship with the developing world and the developing kind of
Some BRICS members.
Right. So it's got economic ties and it's got international geopolitical relevance beyond what I think the average American or the average Israeli understands. So if it falls into civil war, and if all of its military goods and its uranium and nuclear infrastructure is up for grabs, that doesn't put the world in a safer place. That puts the world in a more dangerous place.
Yeah, and it goes back to the point, will Russia and China allow Iran to go into not a civil war, but it just would even allow for a regime change?
And if they do,
should not be ignored.
Would they force a Russian or Chinese motivated regime change instead of an Israeli regime change?
Exactly. And talking about Russia, how do you think that will impact Ukraine? Because Russia is obviously busy with Ukraine right now. They just lost one of their main suppliers. Could that weaken Russia much? How important was Iran for the Russian war against Ukraine?
I don't know that I don't think anybody outside of intelligence circles really knows how important Iran was to Russia's continued conflict in Ukraine. Much of Russia's success is domestic. Much of their weapons making and weapons manufacturing capability really is within Russia itself. It benefited from partnerships early on, especially with Iran and North Korea. But as it continues to kind of project its war, it's learned the economic benefits of being a wartime country and a wartime economy. So I'm not sure that damaging Iran is going to significantly hamper Russia's position in Ukraine, especially considering the fact that Ukraine is also struggling with maintaining support from the West.
In wars like this, how active would back-channel communications be? I remember, I'll give you an example. When I asked President Lukashenko that question, because obviously he was someone that mediated do you remember that, everyone forgets about it, the mutiny against Putin that happened 2 years ago. Everyone forgot what Wagner and Prigozhin did back then, and that Lukashenko got them to reach some sort of agreement. So I asked him about it, and he told me about all the communication that happened behind the scenes, and then he managed to get an agreement between Putin, and he managed to convince Prigozhin not to continue marching towards the Kremlin by telling him, hey, if you continue marching towards the Kremlin, Belarus will get involved, and will get involved in the support of Putin. And he, in Lukashenko's words, he says this is the reason that Prigozhin stopped marching. And the reason I ask that question is I'm always curious, and I ask this to a lot of leaders, is how much back-channel communications happen? Do you think there's back-channel communications right now directly between Iran and Israel? And if so, how often do you think they communicate? or is it all through third parties and is very limited? I'm just very curious as when there's countries that have tens of millions of people that are being impacted by their decisions, do the leaders at least talk to each other no matter how much they hate each other?
Usually the answer is no. Usually those leaders
that's
do
crazy.
not talk to each other because there's political ramifications if they do, right? In order for Netanyahu to have a conversation with any of the leaders in Iran, it would essentially make it look like Netanyahu is not in as powerful a position as he wants people to believe. Because if he's willing to take a call from any senior administrator, any senior theologian, it doesn't matter. Anybody he takes a call with is now, through the eyes of the people, equal to them. So because of that political posturing, what happens in conflict is they push communication down the chain. So it's some mid-level bureaucrat in the Foreign Affairs Office who talks to another mid-level bureaucrat in a Foreign Affairs Office for a third country who talks to another mid-level bureaucrat in Iran. And only after these mid-level bureaucrats reach some sort of agreement does the call escalate up and escalate up higher and higher. I mean, a fantastic example of this is what you've seen between Ukraine and Russia, where Putin intentionally chooses not to attend meetings he says he will attend because he wants to show that he has the power to not show up, which makes Russia look strong. And then when Zelensky shows up to a negotiating table and Putin doesn't show up, it makes Ukraine look weak, right? That's the game that leaders try to play.
Yeah, true. But so there is, so obviously there would be indirect communications between the two countries. So let's kind of pivot to the big elephant in the room, American involvement. First question, I asked you that earlier. Do you think how much do you think the US knew about this attack? Because you kind of hinted that Netanyahu made that decision by himself, which is not a good look for Trump and for the US. So do you think they were at least aware, because they were informed of the attack? The ambassador said that, and I think Israel said that publicly before that. Do you think they were informed of the attack? And how much in details do you think they would have gotten from Israel?
I do believe that they were informed, and I do believe they were probably told some pretty specific details in the hours immediately before the attack. I don't believe that Israel would have advised the U.S. weeks in advance of the day, time, and strategy. I think they would have said, hey, we're going to launch an attack against the nuclear facilities. We're going to use Mossad. We're going to attack and try to assassinate, political and nuclear power brokers in Iran, within the borders of Iran. We are going to do this. And the United States probably had a chance to say, hey, we would like that you reconsider this. We would like that if you launch this attack, you launch it in July or August. Like, there's all of that kind of negotiation most likely happened. But at the end of the day, I do not believe Donald Trump knew in detail 48 hours before Israel launched their attack. I think Donald Trump probably would have found out the details 4 hours or 6 hours before Israel launched the attack. And part of that is because Israel's trying to compartmentalize the opportunity for a leak, because they don't know whether or not somebody in the United States could leak the information to Israel or leak the information to Iran. Keep in mind that about a year ago, that's exactly what happened. A year ago, Israel was sharing information with the United States, and then an NSA person at the United States leaked the information worldwide. So there's a precedent now for Israel to not share all of its details with the United States.
That's crazy. That's true. I remember I think they were just sentenced to 3 years in jail yesterday, the day before you saw that. But that's crazy. I completely forgot about that. That was the plan. Was that plans for an Israeli response to an Iranian attack that was leaked to some media organizations? I can't remember what it was. What does that say about U.S. intelligence? That's pretty surprising.
And I think this is what when you talk about the elephant in the room, Mario, you have to be talking about the decline of American reliability and American influence worldwide. And I think that's what Donald Trump is really struggling with right now, is he's trying to find a way to rebuild that counterbalance of influence that the United States used to have, because the United States has been riddled with spies from China and Russia in our CIA and our military and our army and our navy. We've been absolutely riddled with fundamentalists, with ISIS and other extremists being built right here at home, here in the United States. So, the security and the protection of the United States is in question. And now you're starting to see that there's sympathizers within our own intelligence infrastructure that are trying to involve themselves in the conflict in Israel, and the conflict in Ukraine, and the conflict in Taiwan. It's a bad look for a country that's supposed to look like it's the premier professional intelligence organization of the world.
Yeah, I agree. And also the fact that the US did not have the ability to authorize such an attack by Israel would say a lot about the US position in the world, the US hegemony as well. Like, it's more and more things that are starting to indicate that we do live in a multipolar world, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I don't know how that will materialize because we really haven't lived through a multipolar world for such a long time. And there's advantages and disadvantages to hegemony. But I think you'd agree with that statement that the US influence in the world and the Middle East, has it, actually, I'm going to challenge it, has it diminished? Because you've also got a major enemy of the US that's been significantly weakened, a strong ally to US and to China and Russia. So maybe there's another way of looking at this, is that this could be a US success story. That, hey, we've managed to take out, without actually getting involved, we've managed to take out one of our main enemies. Is that a fair argument to make as well?
I would say that it's a fair argument that diminishing Iran benefits the United States. That's a very fair argument. But the United States can't take credit for it. The United States wasn't involved. The United States doesn't have a clear line of accountability to the conflict, to the strategy, to the planning. It's all Israel. And if anything, the public, what's been shared publicly, is that the United States is trying to negotiate with Iran. So if the United States is trying to negotiate with Iran, and then an ally of the United States bombs them before the negotiation can even take place, does that make it look like anybody respects the United States?
And kills the negotiator, Andrew, as well.
Correct. So the United States, if anything, I think Donald Trump is probably pissed because Netanyahu just made Trump look bad, right, in front of the whole world. And that's what I think Putin is also doing the same thing in Ukraine. During Trump's lead up to the election, Netanyahu and Putin were strong supporters of a Donald Trump administration. But once he became the president, then they started making their own kind of unilateral decisions, understanding that if Trump wants them to cooperate, then they know how to work like Trump works. They know how to make demands that are too big. They know how to negotiate with flex instead of just negotiating with diplomacy. And that's part of the world that we live in, is that we live in a world where people are becoming more aggressive and less diplomatic.
And one could say that they know Trump's position as you know, you learn in poker, you should never share your hand. I'm not a poker player, but that's what I hear. And you've essentially got Trump saying, you know, he's been very vocal since before becoming president. He does not want to start any war. If anything, he wants to end wars. That's a great thing to stand for. But if you make that position very clear, it gives you know, a strong position, a tactical position for allies and rivals or enemies to the US. So you mentioned Putin, obviously Netanyahu. Netanyahu knows the US does not want to get involved, and that gives him the ability to wage a war without worrying about the US. You know, and also he knows Trump wants to, you know, seem like he is Israel's #1 ally as president. That's another position that Trump made it clear. So it is possible that Netanyahu is trying to take advantage of these positions that Trump has. So what does that mean? What does that mean for U.S. involvement in the war? Do you think the U.S. could get involved, even if no base is struck? Because obviously Iran's not striking any military installations, American military installations. Could they supply Israel with the GBU-57 bunker buster bombs they need to target or completely destroy the nuclear facilities, especially the Fordow one in Iran? What would be your guess there?
It's a great point, because you have to define what U.S. support means. I would argue Israel already has U.S. support for what's happening in Iran. I can guarantee you Israel has American intelligence. I can guarantee you Israel's using American weapons. I can guarantee you Israelis have received American training in targeting, American training in combat, American training to Mossad. So there's already an incredible amount of American engagement, American involvement already. If what you mean is American military involvement, that's a whole different definition of involvement, right? One of the major differences between Ukraine and Israel is Israel's a thriving economy. So Israel doesn't need the United States to donate them bunker busters. Israel can just buy American-made bunker busters. Where Ukraine needed to go out there with like a beggar's pouch and ask for help, Israel doesn't need to do that. Israel can just place an order and buy it, right? and with all the with all the tariffs and everything else going on, Israel's cooperation with the United States is going to reduce its total number of tariffs. So that means it's going to be able to buy more cheaper in a world where nobody else is buying because of the tariffs that are on top of the cost. So that's going to motivate the United States to sell more to Israel at a reduced price. And Donald Trump is trying to fix a failing economy in the United States. So the last thing he's going to do is turn down a buyer of one of America's top exports, which is weapons.
Going back to Hezbollah, again, that was a big surprise to me. It was a surprise, as I said, to the spokesperson, to the ambassadors. I've asked all of them that question. What's Hezbollah's position? So I also got informed that Hezbollah received an ultimatum from the Lebanese government, supported by France and Saudi, that if they get involved, then the Lebanese government, with the support of the Saudis and France, will directly, I don't know what they say, they'll engage in war, or they'll try to stop Hezbollah from being involved. I'm not sure if that means targeting Hezbollah positions or just dismantling their rocket launchers. Is Hezbollah getting out of the tentacles of Iran? Do you think it's still can be considered an Iranian proxy? And also, maybe you can also break down, if not sure if there's something you can break down, is how do these proxies work? Is it just like Khamenei, or we don't know who now because many of them have been assassinated, calls, I don't know who on the Hezbollah side because many of them have been assassinated, and says, I need you to do X, Y, Z. Is it as simple as that? Or is it a bit more convoluted because Hezbollah has responsibilities for Lebanon, but also responsibilities for Iran?
So two fantastic questions. To your first point, I want to highlight something that I think you understand, Mario, and most of your audience understands if they're in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is a massive geopolitical player. In the United States and Europe, people don't realize that. They kind of look past Saudi Arabia. Oftentimes, people in Europe and the United States think that Saudi Arabia is like some backwoods country, like old school kingdom, like that they're not modern and they're not powerful. I don't know why, but that's the attitude of many Europeans and many Americans. Where when you live in the Middle East, when you're in the Middle East, you understand Saudi Arabia is a massive power broker. They have a massive sphere of influence, and they have incredible diplomatic and military power. So when Israel launched against Iran, I think it understood that the Abraham Accords between Saudi Arabia and Israel were never achieved. They were never finalized, right? Because of the war in Gaza. So there is no formal recognition between Saudi Arabia and Israel. However, when Israel starts to weaken Iran, that's something Saudi Arabia likes, because Saudi Arabia's primary power conflict in the Middle East is Iran. So a weaker Iran is a stronger Saudi Arabia. So now Saudi Arabia has to, on a certain level, be supporting Israel in their conflict against Iran, but not supporting Israel in their conflict against the Palestinians. So this is what I meant earlier when I said that Israel understands it's gaining favor in the region by diminishing Iran. So your point about Hezbollah, I think, is a powerful point, because now Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. What a proxy means is it means that they get a lot of their funding, a lot of their training, a lot of their capability from another nation state. So Hezbollah is a transnational threat that gets its support from Iran. It doesn't mean it's 100% at Iran's direction, but it's largely at Iran's direction, and for sure tied to Iranian support. So if Hezbollah gets involved and Saudi Arabia and Lebanon decide to reduce Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon even more, that's the world seeing Saudi Arabia really executing its leverage in a way that it hasn't seen before. To your point about how do proxies get activated, how do proxies get used, proxy leaders usually know what they want to carry out in terms of objectives. They want to cause conflict, they want to cause disarray, they want to cause an attack, they want to kill people, they want to drive some sort of political ambition. That's what a terrorist group does, is they achieve political goals through fear and death. So what they'll do is they'll oftentimes unilaterally kind of select their targets, coordinate it, and get the approval from Iran, but otherwise operate on their own, kind of asking permission because they want to make sure they get permission so that they get the funding they need to spend on the weapons and to spend on the training and the troops. So that they need a positive relationship there. But it's not necessarily at Iranian direction. Sometimes Iran will direct an attack, but most of the time the actual proxies will choose their targets.
I want to ask you another question. It just popped to mind because I want to move a bit to Gaza. Wasn't planning to, but I think it's worth covering. Because I feel like a lot of the attention is moved away from Gaza, which is the most heartbreaking to me. Like I think Iran, great debate. Did Israel make the right decision, the wrong decision? I think it's a really good debate. Hezbollah, another great debate. There's a threat to Lebanon, to Israel's border, and Hezbollah started attacking Israel first. Gaza is just a much trickier discussion because it started off as a very logical discussion, a terrorist attack on Israel, Israel responded, but now it's been into, I think it's been about 2 years, and the amount of death and destruction is just heartbreaking to say the least. But before talking about Gaza, I want to talk about October 7th. How could Mossad, I know there's various conspiracy theories there and I haven't dug into them, but just a very innocent general question, how could Mossad that had all these capabilities against Hezbollah, had all these capabilities against Iran, have such a failure on their own border when it comes to Hamas? Couldn't they intercept? Now, I think I've heard you talk about this before. I think I listened to you. Yeah, you've made the comparison to 9/11 that a lot of these, the hierarchy communicating between each other. I now remember you answered that question as well, but I would love you to break it down again. Is how could they have such a failure? Because we can ask that question now because you talked about it after Hezbollah, but now we have Iran as well, another massive success for Mossad. But that's the same Mossad that missed Hamas's October 7th attack.
So it's such an interesting question, and there's a reason that it's so rife with conspiracy theory, because people can't process how does such a capable intelligence service fail inside its own country. What people don't understand is that when Mossad is an external intelligence service, just like CIA. What that means is their primary mission set is outside of their own country of origin. Their job is to prosecute intelligence collection in every other country except Israel. Inside Israel, that belongs to the Shin Bet. The Shin Bet is the FBI equivalent of the Israeli intelligence services inside of Israel. So whenever you've got targets of interest or potential threats or terrorist activity inside Israel, that's the responsibility of Shin Bet. Now, Shin Bet and Mossad work together because Mossad finds threats from outside that have relevance to what's happening on the inside, and of course Shin Bet finds threats that are on the inside that have relevance to the outside. So Mossad and Shin Bet have to share and cooperate the same way FBI and CIA have to share and cooperate. But then Israel also has a third layer that doesn't exist in the United States because it has the army, right? And inside Israel, you've got compulsory military service, which means the people in the army, people in the military, aren't professional military members. They're just doing their kind of commitments within their service so that they can be a good, upstanding citizen. That doesn't mean that they are not committed. It just means that they're not as committed as a professional military service member. And the military is charged with much of the protection in areas of active hostility with any kind of, with Palestinians or with Hamas. So you've got the military and Shin Bet and Mossad, who all have to coordinate information in order to stay ahead of a threat. As if that's not complicated enough, you also have the hierarchy of careerism inside each of those three organizations. So you've got the ground troop who's motivated to do a good job, and then the middle manager who's trying to grow their career, and then the senior officer who's trying to protect their career, for all three organizations trying to cooperate and coordinate. So in hindsight, I think what we've learned since the October 7th attacks is that the threat was identified, the threat was reported up the chain inside the military. Somewhere in the middle of the military leadership, they didn't deem the report as valid, so they didn't put appropriate resourcing behind it to prevent from the attack. So then when the attack happened, everybody looks at Mossad and Shin Bet and says, you failed. And nobody's really looking at the military and saying that you made a mistake on the border. So you have all these convoluted mistakes that happened, and we have to remember mistakes happen, right? When there's a massive success like that has psychological warfare benefits, of course Israel's going to share it far and wide. That's why they shared the footage of them launching drones from within Iranian borders, right? Because they see the psychological and informational warfare benefit of sharing that news story. But when they find their own mistakes, they're not going to make that public. They're not going to share those details. So they squash them, and in the absence of information, people are just left wondering.
We see a lot of leaks in sensitive times like this. I talked about the leak earlier of reports that, for example, Trump did not authorize Israel to assassinate the leader Khamenei, which will be a whole new level of breaking international law. I think that the international law, you're not allowed to strike the leader of another state, as far as I understand. How much of these leaks are just information warfare intentionally placed there to achieve a certain objective versus them being genuine leaks?
I would say probably 90% of what's leaked is politically motivated.
Oh,
It's an artificial leak. It's somebody speaking off the books who wants to drive some sort of political agenda. And then only 10% of what you see is truly just a bystander who's trying to do the right thing, a whistleblower who just wants the information to be known, right? The majority of it is some diplomat or some politician or some military officer or some person of influence who's speaking off the record because they want the information to be released, because it is either intentional disinformation or it's information that drives an agenda that's in benefit of that politician.
That's crazy. Like, it's
People
so
don't-
hard now to understand what to believe.
People don't realize it. Yeah. The thing is, imagine how, like, even we were talking earlier about your phone. Your WhatsApp it's end-to-end encrypted. Nobody is going to find out what you're talking about on WhatsApp unless they specifically target your phone or they target the phone of the person you're talking to. That's the only way that they can get the encryption key for your message. So the only way that that information that you're talking about gets shared is if you or the other person chooses to share the information. Now, sometimes there's a mistake, like what happened in the United States when Hegseth sent a message to the journalist, right? So there's mistakes that happen. And that's part of the 10% where, hey, there's a leak and nobody has an agenda, it's just a leak. But the majority of the time, you're choosing which message from all of the messages that you had with your partner, which message am I going to share, and which message are they going to share, and who are we going to share it with, and will we say it's from us, or will we say that it's an anonymous source? It's all an information and warfare power play.
Yeah. The information warfare that we face is mind-boggling. It's also mind-boggling and it's pretty scary is how easily we're influenced. Just remember, a week ago, there was all the news was talking about was about Trump and Elon having that beef. Now remember, I literally went to interview President Milei because they were talking about the bill, spending bill, and Elon's concern was about America's debt. So I interviewed President Milei about that. As we're editing the interview, I landed back here in Dubai, and then the war breaks out. I'm like, wow, everyone forgot about that. And you mentioned Hegseth and the leak. That was everything everyone was talking about, and that was the most important thing in the news. People have just moved on. And there's, I think, something between the Trump-Elon thing and there's a protest in LA that no one's talking about anymore, the ICE protest. Which goes to the next question, something you talk a lot about, is how effective and how common is information warfare? Like, what are we being exposed to on a daily basis that counts as information warfare?
So to understand information warfare, you have to kind of think like the national security apparatus. You've got all these different types of warfare. There's intelligence warfare, there's information warfare, there's cyber warfare, there's traditional warfare, and then put them all on a scale of how much they cost, like actual dollars and cents. Traditional conflict is very, very expensive. Intelligence conflict is not as expensive, but still very expensive. Cyber conflict is cheaper than either of the other two. Information warfare is the cheapest type of warfare. It means that with any budget, you can maximize your impact with information warfare. And then information warfare is also beneficial because you don't have to direct 100% of it. All you have to do is direct a small amount, and then that small amount, like a pebble in a pond, it has a ripple effect. And you drop one story, and everybody else picks up the story. And then they add their own slant and their own bias. And there's a game we play in elementary school here in the United States called Telephone, where 5 people sit in a row, 5 children sit in a row. One child tells one child next to him a story or a word, and then you watch as the story changes before it gets to the 5th person. That's all the benefit of information warfare. So in the world that we live in, Mario, I speak one language fluently. I speak English fluently. Everything else that I speak has mixed fluency. How many languages do you speak fluently?
2, English and French.
English and French. So that means you and I are highly susceptible to whatever media comes out in our native languages. But we don't even know what the media is in Arabic or Portuguese or Spanish or Chinese. So there can literally be the same story presented in completely different formats, but in different languages. So the information warfare landscape that you and I understand is only the information warfare landscape of our native languages. There's more information being spread in every other language across the land. And the people originating those messages are the people who understand that they're only going to be interpreted by people who speak that native language. So anytime a story comes out in English, that story is cultivated only for native English speakers, not anybody else. And anytime a story comes out in Mandarin, it's cultivated only for native Mandarin speakers, not anybody else. So one of the big benefits of AI that I'm looking forward to is AI is going to be able to immediately translate all the information from all the different languages and isolate it into your native language. So that has pros and cons in the information landscape, but it is something that I'm looking forward to because there's less opportunity now for me to be forced to only listen to English-speaking media.
Yeah, I think that kind of goes into how USAID and other NGOs were able to have so much influence around the world, is that they did not have like one major outlet that they leveraged to be able to influence the thinking across different countries, but they invested in local journalists or local media outlets, and they would just be donating money to all these or investing money or paying all these different journalists, having a program that allows them to infiltrate that country by having journalists or media outlets on the ground. And Ukraine is the most obvious example. There's been many others that were reported in the leaks, to disseminate information based on a certain narrative, which goes to your point that each language has their own information warfare going on, which is crazy. Like I just imagine massive offices and intelligence officer, the CIA, for example, that has to disseminate all that information, all these different languages.
Well, it's not necessarily, you'd be surprised. It's not a large office because in information warfare, you've got two terms that you have to keep in mind. You have messaging and narrative. I've been talking about messaging, but when you were responding to my comment, you talked about narrative. They're not the same thing, right? Messaging has to do with what is the statement or the story that you're making that has an emotional appeal to it. It has to have an emotional appeal, right? Children are dying in Gaza. Mothers are watching their sons and husbands get killed in Ukraine. Like these are emotional things. So you send out an emotional message when you're creating an information warfare piece. But then what happens is everybody else who hears that piece picks it up. They have an emotional reaction to it, and then they create a logical story out of it. They create a narrative, and then that narrative spreads. When you control the messaging, it's very hard to control the narrative. So what that means is information warfare is very inexpensive because you only need a few people to create messages, and then those messages spread, and the narratives go into whatever direction they're going to go into, which is why you have some narratives that are pro-Gaza, and so some narratives that are pro-Palestine, and some narratives that are anti-Israel, and some narratives that say that if you support Palestine, then you support Hamas. Like the narratives are hard to control.
Yeah, that's been very fascinating. This is where, is that part of information warfare? So there's been 2 points that have been really fascinating to me. It's like anyone that supports Gaza, immediately they put them in the basket, they support Hamas. But they're completely different things. And then the same thing with Israel. It's like everyone that's critical of Israel as a country, they're attacking Jews or they're anti-Semite, which is also fascinating. And I know you've talked about this as well, which is why I'm bringing it up. Is that part of the information warfare? And if it is, it's been extremely successful because I've never seen a country where the country like Iran, no one has mixed Iran with Shiites. Iran is Iran, Shiites are Shiites. But with Israel, not everyone, but people are are being criticized whenever they criticize Israel. They're like, hey, why are you attacking Jews? And I've seen this, I won't mention the name. A very high profile interviewer that I heavily respect was interviewing a Palestinian, so they're pretty critical of Israel, just to be respectful of them. They've been in the middle, but they were also interviewing a Palestinian official. And when the official was criticizing Israel, they're like, so you must hate Jews. He's like, no. I love Jews, I don't mind Jews, but I just think Israel's strategy here against Gaza has just been very brutal and we should be criticizing it, blah, blah, blah. He's like, yeah, but most of Israelis are Jews. So if you're criticizing Israel, you're obviously criticizing Jews. What percentage of Israelis are Jews? So it's like he couldn't see, and someone's very smart. It's like he couldn't see that line between them. Is that part of information warfare, or is it just humans being humans?
It's both. Information warfare is so effective because humans are predictable, because humans will be humans. So I already know that if I talk about children to a parent, that person will respond differently to my message than if I speak about children to somebody who's not a parent. So I can make one message that I already know is going to have a different level of response in one community than in a different community. But it will make an impact in both communities with one message. So that's what's so powerful about it. There's another concept in information warfare called the signal and the noise. The signal and the noise. The noise is all the different opinions, all the different positions, all the different chatter that come about secondary to the message that's been transmitted. The signal is the message that's been transmitted. So it's very difficult for FBI, Shin Bet, for counter spies, for people who are trying to prevent information warfare. It's very difficult for them to isolate the signal because there's so much noise. You saw this during the elections in 2020, the elections in 2016 here in the United States. You saw the FBI and NSA and the Counterintelligence Center come out and say, hey, foreign countries are going to try to influence our election, and they're going to do it on social media. So everybody beware. That's all they could do, because it was so hard for them to isolate which account was a real person, which account was a bot, which account was actually a feeder for repeating or engagement of another fake account just to get traction. So it's very difficult to reverse engineer information warfare without the benefit of AI. And one of the things that AI will most likely be heavily involved in the future is trying to find the signal in the noise.
But also able to generate a lot of noise as well.
Generate more signals and more noise, exactly right.
So right now it's humans trying to spot which humans are trying to create some noise. In the future, it's going to be AI, so agents kind of spotting other agents that are creating noise. It's a fascinating world. And it's just fascinating to see how the warfare is just changing. The drones are a great example of that, what we saw in Russia, what we saw in Iran. Just on a kind of final few points on the Iran war, which is obviously ongoing right now. And that's the risk of radiation leak. We talked about it earlier off camera. And the risk, and you mentioned it briefly, of Iran having a nuclear weapon, or someone I interviewed said there's a risk, and I still struggle to believe that to be a genuine risk of Israel using a nuclear weapon, which I think is, in my mind, is completely off the table. But I'd love to get your thoughts on these 3 points. So a radiation leak and the risks of that. As someone lives in Dubai, which is close by to Iran, it's a concern. Number 2 is a nuclear attack by Iran, and they might have a nuclear weapon through a briefcase, something, or what do you call it, a dirty bomb, for example. And the third one is a potential nuclear attack by Israel.
So in my experience, in the U.S. military nuclear service, as well as the U.S. CIA, in my experience, nobody wants to use a nuclear weapon. Nobody wants to use a nuclear weapon because it's so devastating in so many ways. It's economically devastating. It destroys life, it destroys infrastructure, it destroys land, and then it has secondary impact on neighboring countries. It has secondary impact on non-nuclear targets with a change in the wind, right? So the traditional large-scale nuclear weapon, nobody wants to see those be used. Everybody wants to use them as a deterrent. A deterrent means, hey, I have a nuke, so don't mess with me. I have a nuke, so obey my boundaries, right? Obey my statements. That said, we have watched as the threat of nuclear deterrence has become less impactful over time, right? Ukraine invaded into Russia. No nuclear response. Israel has bombed nuclear facilities inside Iran. You've seen conflict all over the world where there has not been nuclear escalation of the kind that we saw during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the question becomes whether or not we're actually getting closer to the use of a nuclear weapon, specifically because people want to send a message saying, remember, nuclear weapons are devastating. So why do I say that? I say that because I think Israel has less of an appetite to use a nuke than Iran. Israel doesn't want to be the country that sends a nuke into Iran. They don't want the world to think that they're not strong enough to handle it conventionally. They don't want to destroy Iranian infrastructure, because if they destroy Iranian infrastructure, when they commit their regime change, that the first thing that regime is going to have to do is clean up a nuclear fallout site. So Israel does not have an appetite for using a nuclear weapon, but Iran understands that it may only have one option left. The only option it has left may be a small tactical nuclear warhead delivered by a truck into some other country, into Israel or into a pro-Israeli state. We don't even know. But Iran understands that if it has a nuclear warhead, and a warhead capability is very different than a delivery vehicle capability. And a delivery vehicle capability is different than the success of that delivery vehicle going into the actual target. This is what we're watching with North Korea all the time, right? North Korea continues to have these failed delivery vehicles, missiles that fall out of the sky or rockets that go off trajectory or whatever. So if Iran doesn't have a warhead, or if they haven't developed their own warhead, but they have someone else's warhead, say a Russian warhead that was given to them, we don't know. And what they do with that warhead is going to be critically important, because if Iran uses a nuke, the world is going to wake up to, oh shit, we shouldn't mess with people that have nukes. But if Israel uses a nuke, then the whole world's going to turn on Israel and say, why would you nuke a country that's poorer and weaker, and you already have military dominance? So it's a question of how it would work.
Are you worried as well of a radiation leak, or?
I'm less worried about a radiation leak in terms of nuclear weapons, because nuclear weapons are solid state. They're a solid state version of uranium or plutonium. So it's not like when a nuclear reactor has a meltdown, then you have to worry about a leak. I lived in Abu Dhabi, Mario, in 2018, 2019. And my primary concern in Abu Dhabi was that Iran would target Abu Dhabi rather than target Israel, because Abu Dhabi is pro-Western. Abu Dhabi has a lot of military infrastructure down there that's Emirati owned and Emirati based. And in 2018, 2019, there were still tensions, some growing tensions between Iran and UAE. I don't know what those tensions look like today, but it would be easier for Iran to smuggle something into Abu Dhabi or the UAE than to smuggle something into Israel, but it would still send the same message, right?
Yeah, because then you've pressured the US by striking a US ally, impacting the global economy, but not attacking the US, so the US does not need to get involved, and that changes the whole geopolitical landscape. So that could be just a
correct. And imagine if it wasn't IRGC that delivered the weapon, it was Hamas that delivered the weapon, or Hezbollah that delivered the weapon. Now Iran can even say it wasn't us. So
plausible deniability. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so thank you. I'm leaving Dubai. I'm going back to my home country in Australia, far away from all this. Last question, Andrew, is where do you see the world, not the world, where do you see the Middle East and Iran in the next, let's say, 12, let's stick to 12 months for now?
It's a very difficult thing to predict, right? I think that we will continue to see reduced support for Israel. That's almost a guarantee. I don't think that Bahrain or Saudi or Oman or UAE, I don't think they're going to verbalize support for Israel anytime soon. I think they're going to continue to have a very vocal stance against Israel, no matter how much success Israel has in Iran. They're going to continue to publicly denounce Israeli activity against the Palestinians, because, like you said, that truly is the primary humanitarian issue on the table, right? Is the potential, still undetermined genocide of Palestinians in Gaza at the hand of a supreme military power. So whatever happens in Iran is not going to take the world's attention off of what Israel's doing to the Palestinian people. So I don't see that changing in the next 12 months. I also don't necessarily see Iran collapsing in the next 12 months. I can see Iran being exposed to continued warfare and continued conflict, but I don't know that we're going to see the Ayatollah disappear in the next 12 months. Even if he's killed, a new Ayatollah, a new theocracy will most likely come back. I'm really curious, actually, Mario, if in the next 3 to 6 months, what we actually see is the world try to defend Iran. That's what I'm the most curious to see, because if public sentiment against Israel stays the way it is, then you would arguably start to see protests around the world for them to stop beating up Iran. Right? You would see it in Europe. You could even potentially see it here in the United States. And this whole No Kings movement, the No Kings movement is primarily focused in the United States on the idea of Donald Trump being a king of the United States, but it's really a movement against authoritarian leaders everywhere. So Netanyahu is showing himself to be an authoritarian leader, just like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. These are individuals who are authoritarian in nature, not individuals who are democratic in nature. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens as democracy across Europe is kind of shifting and democracy in the United States is shifting. Could we actually see a world where 6 months from now, public sentiment is pro-Iran?
It's like we're having a war of sentiment today, global war of sentiment.
It's true.
Andrew, really appreciate your time to come in under those circumstances and discuss the war. It's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm sure we'll speak again. I appreciate your time, man.
Thank you, Mario. It was a pleasure meeting you too, sir.